we will not be able to sit with them when they're either being forced by the minister or by their own volition to sack our people for taking what, a month before could have been lawful industrial action. That will lead to a complete breakdown. I don't see how we'll resolve any disputes if hundreds of our people, maybe thousands potentially, are being booted out. It's just not going to help anyone. I don't think they want to be in this position. How we will get ourselves out of that position, if all of those, you put the company under pressure then, what are you going to do about it? These people defied that work notice, having voted to go on strike. I mean, some of you lot will have to work that out for us. You are the people making this decision, and you're the one that are going to put ordinary women and men in this position with their employer, and the employers will be in a similar position, an invidious position, where they've got to make these choices. I'm sure the Tories were elected on the basis that they were going to get rid of red tape, but you're bringing in a new set of law that all these lefty lawyers, as you call them, can challenge. So that will be an interesting... Well, we will never support minimum service levels. It's undemocratic. It's unconservative, in my view. It goes straight to people's right to combine and to be democratic and have their freedoms expressed in a free democracy. And you're oppressing that. You're the Conservative government. And this goes back to the foundations of our democracy, Toll Puddle, the Combination Act and all the rest of it. This is your latest version of the suppression of the right to
just to be clear, this committee is not introducing anything. We're
well, yeah, but you'll get to vote on it. So maybe we'll convince you to vote against it. That'll be the ultimate outcome. So we'll never support it. It won't work. It's going to make things worse. And they were being very careful earlier about what they do. But you've got to remember these people are under a direct instruction from the DfT, from the Transport Secretary. They have to comply with what he says. They've got no right to diverge in any way from the thinking that's coming from the DfT and from BIS at the minute, because they're under state control, which is a strange irony at the minute. You're getting evidence from private sector companies who are under direct state mandate, and you're empowering the state to tell people, to conscript people to go to work when they voted not to go to work under your legislation. So it will never work, and it will create more problems. It will be unsafe. Conscripting people to go past their own union's picket lines and operate complex signalling systems or drive trains is a recipe for disaster, in my opinion. I don't know why you're doing it. Nobody else does it. All this stuff about France and Europe, if you've seen the industrial action in France in the last few months under alleged minimum service levels, they have completely novel ways of taking industrial action, including occupations and blocking tracks and all the rest of it. What you will do through this process is create novel industrial action. If we can't use traditional industrial action as you've been used in Britain for a long time, there will be novel forms of action, and there will be wildcat action, which is what happens in France and Italy and Spain and elsewhere. In Stockholm last week, there was walkouts all over the Stockholm tube network outside the legislation. So it's going to come back on the Conservative Party's heads, I believe, but it won't work whichever way you go with it.
The purpose of this inquiry is to explore what that regulation might look like. We're not debating the principles of the...
Shouldn't they be telling us rather than us telling you?
Well, we are questioning a wide range of witnesses and looking for their input. So in terms of shaping what those regulations might look like, are you engaging with the consultation process? Do you have a role in that?
Well, we've responded to the consultation, but we still don't know what's going to happen. So you could have a completely novel situation where we give 14 days' notice of strike action, and then, as we understand it at this time, the government or the companies give us 4 days' notice inside that 14 days of who's got to work. So it might be quite novel, whereas the companies are always taking us for injunctions. We may have the opportunity to take them for injunctions if they haven't served the notices properly. So I think it's going to be a complete pig's ear, but we will respond. And it's the stuff, it's unsafe, we believe. It's not going to work, and I don't think it will serve the passengers well. And if it's going to go to a national reduced timetable, people like train drivers and signallers will be completely conscripted. You cannot run an 80 or 90% or even a 50% railway service without conscripting all of the signallers and all of the controllers to operate that network. If you want to run a train down into Cornwall, into the north of Scotland, into rural Wales, and all of the towns that were mentioned earlier, Stoke, Middlesbrough, Portsmouth, all poor towns, by the way, I noticed. Maybe that's why they're not getting a service. I'm sure Guildford and Maidenhead always get a service during strike days. But it will be a disaster, and we'll all end up in court, and they'll spend even more money on fighting these cases than they have in trying to break these strikes. And if they'd used a fraction of the money in breaking the strikes in regard to settling them, we could all be back at work now anyway.
I know there have been concerns raised, particularly by the RMT, about where safety would be in this situation. And in the previous discussion, they gave us reassurances that they didn't think that would be the case. Do you agree with that situation?
No, I think they gave you a reassurance to do a risk assessment. So what they do at the moment, when they're getting managers to break strikes, is they put them on a training course for 4 hours, which for a safety critical member of staff would be at least 6 months or maybe a year. And then they put them out. So what they'll do is risk assess it, and they would come up with a risk assessment that says, we don't think there is a greater risk, or the risk can be managed. So that's just health and safety speak for saying we'll just take the risk. And so if we stress safety critical staff by making them come to work on pain of being dismissed, they will just say that's no greater danger. We think they will continue to take that risk. I think they will probably continue to use managers fairly extensively where they can, because I think they're reasonably comfortable with the situation at the moment. I mean, during this dispute, Network Rail sets down the minimum standard that they're going to run, which could be 20-30%, as you've heard, and they will try to operate a system within that, and it's got a defined time period. Now, they seem fairly comfortable with what they're doing. I don't know what your impression was. And I don't think this adds any value to them, but it certainly will put people who don't want to do the work into a stressful situation where you're putting pressed people into safety critical roles, and that shouldn't happen. So that is an enhanced safety risk. But they'll cover themselves with paperwork and say, we did a risk assessment. If Tom and Jamie and others start sacking our people as a result of taking lawful industrial action, that will lead to the complete deterioration, because we will not be able to sit with them when they're either being forced by the minister or by their own volition to sack our people for taking what, a month before could have been lawful industrial action. That will lead to a complete breakdown. I don't see how we'll resolve any disputes if hundreds of our people, maybe thousands potentially, are being booted out. It's just not going to help anyone. I don't think they want to be in this position. If I'm honest with you, I've sat with all of these people for many hours over the years. Not one of them has said to me they want this power and this legislation. They've got no idea how it's going to work, as you've heard, and they are being press-ganged into it as much as anyone else. I don't think anyone wants to be in this position. Because if they don't sack people, what are they going to do? You're putting yourselves in a position where you're given an instruction by the Secretary of State to carry out a minimum service level, and if it doesn't work, what's the Minister of State going to say to you next? He's going to say, or she's going to say, I want those people sacked, so that the next time they come to work. I don't know if you politicians want to put themselves in that position, where they're commanding chief executives to dismiss people for taking strike action. But that's the road you're headed down. I don't know if it will provoke people. At the minute, people who aren't in unions have the right to go on strike, by the way. And I don't know who they're going to pick for a work notice. So if the RMT was on strike and other unions weren't, are they going to put work notices on everybody in case they don't cross a picket line? Because you have the right, as a non-trade unionist or a worker in another union, to not cross a picket line and be protected and indemnified. So I don't know if anyone's thought about that maybe everybody won't come to work. And maybe all the people that aren't in the union won't come to work because they won't get a work notice. Who knows? Will the employers demand to know who is in a union and who is not in a union? They don't have the right to know that at the moment. So I don't know how it's going to work. I don't think anyone else knows how it's going to work, which is what's wrong with the legislation.
Do you think it would differ if it were different types of workers on strike? Because obviously we've got differing, we've got train drivers, we've got, as you say, signal operators, things like that. Do you think this legislation would work differently for different types of workers?
Well, I imagine the employers will prioritise who they want to work. So if I don't suppose that they want somebody in accounts. They're that bothered about whether they come to work or not on a strike day. I'm sure they'd like them to, but they certainly will want signallers and train drivers and conductors to come in. We'll do whatever we can. We will take, and we'll urge the TUC to have a non-compliant strategy. Hopefully we'll do that collectively, so we can do that in the European Court. We can do it in our own courts, depending on how these work notices work. If you look at the history of the legislation since the Tebbit laws, I'm not going to go back over all that, but all these iterations of the laws, they've all ended up in court. They've all ended up with challenges from employers, challenges from various parties. Then you end up with a bit of equilibrium. You find out how it's going to work with all the ballot thresholds and all the rest of it. It settles down, and then the government comes back, or one government comes back and makes a new set of legislation because they weren't content that the unions had defeated or got round the previous legislation. I imagine we'll be involved in that for the next 5 to 10 years. Until somebody serves a work notice on a group of workers, we won't know what the challenge will be. So there are people in certain inns of court around here that will be rubbing their hands, thinking this is great, this is a new area of law. I'm sure the Tories were elected on the basis that they were going to get rid of red tape. But you're bringing in a new set of law that all these lefty lawyers, as you call them, can challenge. So that will be an interesting...
And just a similar related subject, before I go along to your colleagues there, in terms of the access for vulnerable and or disabled passengers, do you think they'd be able to manage that in the situation where you were in a minimum service level? Do you think there'd be any impact into that?
Well, the only way you can manage it adequately is by compelling more people to come to work. So much of the infrastructure is Victorian or of that area with lots of steps and footbridges and all the rest of it. That needs passenger assistance because the lifts aren't there. You will have to get people who people are maybe not thinking, like customer service staff who are not safety critical. If you want to keep that service going, you will have to bring them in. And if the government dictates that more stations should open on this timetable method rather than the priority route, that will mean more people being compelled to come in.
Let me give you a scenario. So a signaller has been served the works notice, and there's a picket line, and they refuse to cross the picket line in this democratic state we call Britain. And what are the legal consequences for that signaller, and what are the consequences for the travelling public?
Well, they lose their indemnity. We don't have a right to strike in this country. There is no right to strike whatsoever. You breach your contract of employment every time you go on strike, and you're indemnified from legal or disciplinary action by the public, by businesses and by your employer. They will lose that indemnity. So they can be subject to the costs of the disruption, and they can lose their job, and they could potentially end up in court because of the costs. So this goes back to the Taff Vale judgment in 1913, when it was my union that was subject to that by a coal company taking our union to court, was nearly broke the union, which was the object. That's where we're going back to, but you'll also be picking on the individual. So they will be sacked. How we will get ourselves out of that position, if all of those, you put the company under pressure then, what are you going to do about it? These people defied that work notice, having voted to go on strike. I mean, some of you lot will have to work that out for us. You are the people making this decision, and you're the one that are going to put ordinary women and men in this position with their employer, and the employers will be in a similar position, an invidious position, where they've got to make these choices under pressure from the government and by the Secretary of State, who goes on the television and says, I'm just a good broker. I put these people together in a room, and I hope they can find a way. Which is completely untrue. It's in the passenger service contract. They're going to go further than just being involved in the negotiations. They're going to be in the disciplinary procedures as well, pressing them to be dismissed.
Yes.
It's the inevitable outcome. Now, the effect on the public will be that it's likely to come to their town. If they work in another industry and there's more industrial action, the government will extend these powers, but it won't resolve the current dispute we're still in, and it won't resolve future disputes. It will make them intractable, I think, because the first thing the unions will say is, we will not leave victimised members behind.
Thanks very much for watching that video all the way to the end. And if you liked it, I've got some better news for you. PoliticsJOE is in the process of launching a podcast. Live in a couple of weeks' time. It's called The Pubcast. Link below, probably somewhere in the comments or the description, something like that. Check it out. Subscribe so you get ready for our first episode. It's coming soon. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, or any of those other slightly weirder platforms. See you soon.